Hello and welcome to Japanese Grammar Lessons. I'm Hitsuji Sensei, and today we'll be talking about verb conjugation. It's gonna be a long one, but stick with me. I promise it'll be worth it. In actual spoken sentences, plain form verbs basically read as future tense verbs. What conjugation does is allow us to modify the verbs into other tenses, tones, contexts, and so on. When we do this in English, we use a lot of auxiliary verbs. For example, if we want to make a verb future tense, we can use the words will or going to. In Japanese, most conjugation is done by changing a verb stem's ending and sometimes adding words afterwards. Many English verbs have weird conjugations that require prior knowledge to perform correctly. They don't really always have a rhyme or reason. However, in Japanese, verbs have a few exceptions to some rules, but otherwise they're very consistent. In this video, we will focus only on what the conjugated forms look like, and later on, we will use the conjugated forms when we learn other grammar. Now, let's talk about the prerequisites for this lesson. There aren't any major prerequisites for this lesson. However, knowing several verbs, including des, will be immensely helpful. Now, on to the grammar. This lesson will be split into 3 distinct parts. In part 1, we will discuss what is called an ichidan verb. In part 2, we will discuss what we call a godan verb. And in the last part, we'll discuss some exceptions. Each section will include the following verb conjugations. Mizenkei, also called nai or negative form. Renyokei, also called conjunctive or mas form. Jishokei, also called dictionary or plain form. Meireikei, also called imperative or command form. Kateikei, also called hypothetical form. Ikokei, or volitional form. And tekei and takei, also called te and ta form. Te and ta form conjugate the same way for each verb, but they end differently and they have different uses. Now, that's a lot of information, so let's start to break it down. As I said before, we'll start with the ichidan verbs. I also think of these as the eru and iru verbs. A few examples include taberu, miru, neru, and sugiru. When I learned the verbs in high school, we also called these group 2 verbs, but I like to start with them first. This is because they're a little simpler to conjugate and a lot more recognizable. For every ichidan conjugation, you'll simply drop the ru for each verb stem and add the relevant verb ending. When I say verb stem, I'm just referring to the part of the verb that basically stays the same no matter what the form is. Let's see what this looks like using taberu and miru as examples. For nai form, we'll simply drop the ru and add nai. So taberu becomes tabenai, and miru becomes minai. For mas form, we'll drop the ru and add mas. So for taberu, this just becomes tabemasu, and miru becomes mimasu. The verb's dictionary form is what we're starting with. In this case, taberu and miru. For the imperative form, we'll drop the ru and add ro. So taberu becomes tabero, and miru becomes miro. For hypothetical form, we'll drop the ru and add reba. So taberu becomes tabereba, and miru becomes mireba. For the volitional form, we'll drop ru and add yo. Note here that this is an extended o sound. So taberu becomes tabeyo, and miru becomes miyo. For te form and ta form, we will drop the ru and add te and ta respectively. So taberu becomes tabete or tabeta, and miru becomes mite or mita. So ichidan verbs were pretty simple, but godan verbs get a little more complicated. Godan verbs are basically all of the other verbs in the language, with some exceptions. These verbs will end in u, tsu, ru, bu, mu, nu, ku, gu, and su. When I first learned about these verbs, we referred to them as group 1 verbs. For most of the verb conjugations, the ending will follow a similar pattern. Generally speaking, it will follow an a, I, u, e, o pattern. We'll use iku as an example for this. For nai form, iku becomes ikanai. With verbs that end in u, like omo, we actually drop the u and turn it into a wa instead. So, in the case of omo, it becomes omowanai. For mas form, iku becomes ikimasu. For dictionary form, we just have iku. For imperative form, iku becomes ike. Hypothetical form looks very similar here. Iku becomes ikeba. And for volitional form, iku becomes iko. Again, note here that the O is an elongated O sound. Essentially, we keep the consonant the same, but change the vowel sound in each conjugation. This change is easy to see in romaji, but the change is a little less obvious when you look at the characters in hiragana. Now you'll notice that I didn't touch on the te and ta forms yet. This is because they vary between 5 different groups within the godan verbs. This is actually why they're called godan verbs. Go means 5, and dan in this case means part or step. The first group of godan verbs end in u, tsu, and ru. To conjugate these verbs into te or ta form, you'll drop the last character, add a little tsu, and then add te or ta. For those of you who don't know, a little tsu means that there's a 1-count pause between the 2 sounds it's in the middle of. So an example of an u verb is omo. This becomes omotte and omotta. For tsu verbs, we have matsu, which becomes matte and matta. And finally, for ru verbs, we have naru, which becomes natte or natta. The next group are bu, mu, and nu verbs. To conjugate these verbs into te and ta form, we drop the verb ending and turn it into nde or nda. A bu verb example is asobu, which becomes asonde or asonda. A mu verb example is yomu, which becomes yonde or yonda. Finally, there's actually only one nu verb in the entire language, shinu, which becomes shinde or shinda. To conjugate ku verbs into te or ta form, you drop the ku and you add ite or ita. An example of this is kiku, which becomes kiite or kiita. Gu verbs are very similar, but they're split into their own group. To conjugate a gu verb into te or ta form, you drop the gu and add ide or ida. An example of this is the verb isogu, which becomes isoide or isoida. Finally, we have su verbs. We conjugate su verbs into te or ta form by dropping the su and adding a shite or shita. An example of this is the verb dasu, which becomes dashite or dashita. Now that covers the basics of almost all verbs, but there are some significant exceptions. 2 of the most unique verbs are suru and kuru, and they're very, very common, so it's important to learn how they conjugate. They don't exactly follow a pattern either, so this is the one case where you're just gonna have to know this stuff. We'll go down the line for each of them, starting with suru. To conjugate suru into nai form, we turn it into shinai. To conjugate suru into mas form, we turn it into shimasu. As we learned, dictionary form is just suru. To conjugate suru into imperative form, we turn it into shiro. To turn suru into hypothetical form, we change it into sureba. The potential form of suru is perhaps the most unique exception. There is no potential form of suru itself, so we just use the verb dekiru. This is because suru itself means to do, and dekiru just means to be able to. And if you want to conjugate dekiru further, dekiru works just like a regular ichidan verb. To conjugate suru into its volitional form, it becomes shiyo. And finally, to get the te or ta form of suru, it becomes shite or shita. The closest pattern that I can find for suru is that for all forms except for the hypothetical and potential forms, it conjugates like an ichidan verb. But don't think of this as a hard rule. It's just a sort of pattern that will help us remember how it conjugates. Next, we have the verb kuru. To conjugate kuru into its nai form, it becomes konai. To conjugate kuru into its mas form, it becomes kimas. And as we see, its dictionary form is just kuru. To conjugate kuru into its imperative form, it becomes koi. To conjugate kuru into its hypothetical form, it becomes kureba. To conjugate kuru into its potential form, it becomes korareru. Now, the volitional form doesn't really make sense for kuru, but if you ever wanted to use it, it would become kiyo. And finally, to conjugate kuru into its te or ta forms, it becomes kite or kita. That covers all of the major verbs, but there are still some sneaky verbs that we have to look out for. The most common offender is iku, or to go. All of the forms of iku conjugate exactly how you would expect them to, with one exception. Iku's te and ta forms actually function like the first group of godan verbs u, tsu, and ru. So, to conjugate iku into its te or ta forms, we drop the ku, add a little tsu, and then te or ta respectively. So, iku becomes itte or itta. Then we have a group of fake ichidan verbs like kiru, kaeru, hairu, and shaberu, among many others. These verbs, when written in Romaji especially, appear like ichidan verbs, but they're actually godan verbs. When they're written in kanji, though, it's a lot easier to tell because for the most part, it will just end in the ru, and you won't see the e or the i like you would normally in other ichidan verbs. So, when you see these verbs, you treat the ru just like they were a godan verb. I'll list several more examples of these in the description below, but if you're ever uncertain, always look up an ichidan verb in the dictionary. That way you can see how it's truly supposed to be conjugated. Another verb with a very small exception is the verb kureru. The command form of kureru is just kure, not kurero. Otherwise, it functions just like a normal ichidan verb. Another odd verb is the verb aru, and you'll see this one plenty as well. The negative form is just nai instead of aranai. This is actually the nai that you see in all of the other negative verb conjugations. Finally, there are some weird verbs like the verb to that have interesting te and ta forms. Normally, with a verb like this, we would drop the u, add a little tsu, and then the te or ta. But in the case of to and other similar verbs, we just add a te or a ta at the end. So in this example, to becomes to te and to ta. And yes, for our final time, those o's are elongated. Don't forget it. As always, there are likely more exceptions to these rules, but these are the most common ones that you'll hear and use. I encourage you again to list some other exceptions that we didn't mention in the comments. Now you'll notice that I didn't talk about des in this video, even though we just talked about it in the last one. This is because des is a very unique verb, and it'll make a lot more sense when we discuss it in the context of other adjectives, which I will be doing in the next video, so stay tuned. And that's the introduction to basic verb conjugation. Yes, it was a lot of information, but you made it to the end. Now that we've got a more firm understanding of how verbs conjugate, we'll be able to learn so many grammar principles. As I alluded to before, I have one more video relating to major parts of speech before we learn more complex forms. Once we have a better understanding of des and adjectives, we'll be able to learn a lot more, so stay tuned. Leave your feedback in the comments, like the video if you did, and dislike it if you didn't. If you want to help me grow and reach other people, please subscribe. And if you know anybody who wants to learn Japanese, seriously, casually, or otherwise, please share the video with them. Thanks again for watching. Mata ne!